It's Tuesday, December 10th, 2024. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm here today in Monterey, California with Mr. Ed Kilgore. A Georgia native, Mr. Kilgore earned his undergraduate degree from Emory University and a JD from the University of Georgia. He is a political journalist with more than a quarter century of experience, but before that, and perhaps most importantly, he spent stints with 3 Georgia governors, including Zell Miller, and on the Senate staff of U.S. Senator Sam Nunn. Ed, thank you so much for making the time and especially working a full day and then coming to plumb the depths of your memory. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm enjoying it.
So you were actually born in Columbia, South Carolina, but you grew up moving around Georgia.
My father was in the Army, so I was born at Fort Jackson. But
okay,
we moved back to Georgia. I spent until 1995 when I finally left and went up the Yellow Brick Road to Washington. I lived in Georgia all but a couple of years of my life.
Did you move around the state quite a bit?
Oh yeah, my father was in retail sales.
Oh, okay.
And I used to joke that it was a lot like being an Army brat, except you never actually went anywhere. So we went from pretty much middle Georgia and North Georgia from town to town.
Well, who doesn't want to do the fall line tour?
Yeah, right.
So, tell me, you grew up in Georgia. I assume a Georgia Bulldog fan, but you
Yep.
ended up at Emory.
Well,
Nobody's perfect, and you have to explain yourself.
I tell people this in order to blow their minds, at how old I am. I'm old enough that I went to Emory because I couldn't afford to go to the University of Georgia. That is true. I lived at home, had a scholarship. My family lived in Atlanta at this point.
By that time, yeah.
Had a scholarship, and I really couldn't afford room and board at Georgia.
I see.
That's how relatively cheap Emory was then.
Times change.
So by the time law school came around, Georgia actually had a better reputation as a law school, which I think is true again.
It is.
So I was very pleased to finally get to go to Athens to school.
What did you major in as an undergrad?
It was an interdisciplinary program in humanities that we called the pre-unemployment curriculum. In other words, I didn't know what I was doing, and I spent 2 years sort of wandering around in dead-end blue-collar jobs before I finally, the saying goes, law school is the last refuge of the unimaginative, so that was very much my case. But I'd always wanted to be in politics.
Okay.
That was really why I went to law school.
That was my next question.
Yeah,
Did you actually
I was the
want to
worst
be a lawyer?
little political junkie you've ever met.
Did you volunteer on campaigns, or
A
were
little
you just
bit.
sort
I
of
was actually a baby
follower?
volunteer for Jimmy Carter's first gubernatorial campaign in '66. And was a precinct chairman in Tucker for the George McGovern campaign. Anyway, my first real political memory was in 1960 when I lived in LaGrange.
Okay.
And John F. Kennedy came through LaGrange as part of his presidential campaign. Georgia was actually a competitive state that year. Everybody's forgotten that.
The unpledged elector movement.
So I got to see JFK.
Well, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Jimmy Carter, and I'm just doing the quick math here. The 1970 gubernatorial campaign would have been.
Now, I was not really into politics at that point.
Okay.
And I was also, I wasn't Jimmy's biggest fan after that. I came to admire him a lot. In fact, I've got I'm sure you're aware that most journals pre-write obituaries.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a very adoring obituary of Jimmy Carter for New York Magazine, which I think he may outlive me, so it may be one of these deals where they have to attribute it to the late Ed Kilgore. I don't know.
Yeah. As a reminder, this is December 10th, 2024.
Right. Unbelievable.
So, you went to law school to get into politics. How did that work?
My last year in law school, and then for a brief period of time afterwards, I worked at the Dean Rusk Center at the University of Georgia Law School. And George Busbee, who was then governor, became chairman of the, believe it or not, there was an international trade committee of the National Governors Association. And they needed somebody on his federal state relations staff. He was about to become the chairman of the whole association.
Okay.
They needed somebody on staff to cover that area. I'd already done some contract work for the governor's office on trade policy. And then actually my predecessor in the governor's office left to run Norman Underwood's Senate campaign. In 1979, late 1979, so that created an opening which gave me my first political job.
Okay. So how did this interest in trade develop? Was it there was a job opening, so you made yourself an expert, or?
No, I didn't make good enough grades to be on the law review, but I made good enough grades to be on the International Law Review, so I became an expert.
Well, kids, let that be a lesson to you. Every cloud a silver lining. So tell me about George Busbee, and I think he's one of those governors sort of lost in the shuffle. He's sort of the first sort of business managerial style governor.
Well, he was very much, and he was a wonderful guy, by the way. Just really enjoyed working for him. Was decent to everybody. He was part of that tradition of South Georgia Democrats who were just moderate enough, non-racist, and sort of business-oriented to have some appeal to urban Democrats, but still rooted, in rural Georgia and in the deep in South Georgia, which had, I'm sure you know, had a sort of a political monopoly.
Oh yeah.
For many, many years, dating back to the county unit system. So, so Busbee ran against Lester Maddox, who was trying to make his comeback in 1974, and against Burt Lance, who was Jimmy Carter's friend, a banker from Calhoun. And Busbee won the coveted non-Maddox lane and beat him in a runoff, and and served 2 terms. Was reelected. He was reelected. He was the first governor to be eligible to be reelected, thanks to some good spade work by his chief of staff, Tom Perdue, to amend the Constitution to allow a second term. So it was late in the second half of his second term that I worked for him.
When I think of Busbee are his 2 elections. In the general election in 74 and 78, he beats 2 Republicans that could not be more different.
Yeah.
Machine Gun Ronnie Thompson in 74, and then Rodney Cook absolutely embarrasses Rodney Cook in 1978.
Well, this gets into, I think, the official topic of our interview, which is the realignment of Georgia into a legitimate two-party system. And do you mind if I riff on that for a minute?
Absolutely.
The broader context, which some of your viewers may know, is that there was an ideological sorting out of the 2 parties, particularly in the South, that really began in the 50s with the urbanization of the South. So you developed a modern Republican Party, particularly when Eisenhower was running for office. And then more dramatically in the 1960s, when the Civil Rights Movement realigned Democrats in a leftward direction and Republicans in a rightward direction, making the 2 parties more like they were in other parts of the country. But this sort of sorting out was happening everywhere.
Right.
And it happened at different paces in different states and at different levels of government, usually first at the presidential level. Georgia was really an outlier in some ways. It had been the state that had never gone Republican until the presidential election of 1964, the big breakthrough by Barry Goldwater. But for a variety of reasons, that Democratic habit stuck on a little longer in Georgia than it did in other places. Partly because of demographics. There was just a large enough black vote in Georgia after civil rights to give the party a base. And the old formula, which I'm sure you've heard, was the 90-40 strategy. You try to get 90% of the black vote, 40% of the white vote, and you could win. And Democrats relied on that strategy for a long time, basically asking black voters to support white candidates and not very progressive white candidates, because the alternative was so much worse. Then you had the Jimmy Carter phenomenon, which also sort of froze the state.
Right.
People have forgotten that when Jimmy Carter ran for president in 1976, he arrested what had been a national realignment or a realignment of the South towards the Republican Party, because he was the candidate not just of what passed for Southern liberals, but for the George Wallace voters. George Wallace endorsed him in 1976 after his campaign sort of faded. And as late as 1980, when the country was in the throes of the Reagan Revolution and Reagan was winning a national landslide, Carter won 60% of the vote in Georgia. So their sort of a natural realignment came kind of late to Georgia, and it was very gradual. But I think the breakthrough year, most people would say, the first one was 1994.
Well, how much credit do you give? You talked about demographics and Jimmy Carter, but how much credit goes to your bosses, those Georgia Democrats like George Busby and Joe Frank Harris and Zell Miller and Sam Nunn?
They were smart. They understood the formula they needed to follow. They didn't get too carried away with their conservatism. They were rigorously non-racist, all of them, which counted for something. Unfortunately, it didn't take much. And frankly, they were a lot smarter than the opposition. We used to have a saying in Busby's office, never underestimate the stupidity of the Georgia Republican Party. They had their own leadership problems. Couldn't quite figure out who they were, as you sort of suggested in the 1970s, and could never quite take advantage of the strength of the national ticket at the state level until kind of late in the game. And again, 1994 was the breakthrough when a Georgian, of course, Newt Gingrich, was the sort of the engineer of a national Republican realignment election, at least in the U.S. House of Representatives. I forget how many Democratic House seats in Georgia went down that year.
In that year?
Yeah.
Would have been
3 or 4.
It was 3 in 92,
Yeah.
3 in 94.
Yeah. After we had 2 redistrictings. I remember in 1990, my boss, Sam Nunn, was running for re-election on a ticket with Zell Miller and Pierre Howard, who was lieutenant governor.
Nunn,
and they
Miller,
actually,
Howard.
Yes, you remember, they actually
Nunn, Miller,
ran
Howard.
as a ticket. They had a very tight
Very
message.
old school.
Very old school, Tom Murphy, I think, was still in office, was backing them to the hilt. You had a unified, smart, effective Democratic Party. And it just couldn't last forever, not with the demographic change and with the Republicans finally wising up a little bit.
Right. And as you're pointing out, it's a confluence of factors. And one issue that historians and political scientists point to is the Democratic Party, especially in the legislature, was really good at killing in committee and keeping quiet those wedge issues that would end up splitting the party along conservative.
Absolutely. I remember
lines.
in 1990, it was remarkable that you had a statewide Democratic leadership in certainly in Miller, Howard, and Murphy, who were rigorously pro-choice. And no, there was never an abortion ban that made it to the floor. But that also leads to another sort of element of the eventual unraveling. Georgia had an extraordinarily strong and stable Democratic leadership. They did not train a bench. And when people started retiring and things started falling apart, that became very evident.
So
You did not-
so we're jumping at 90 excuse me.
Well,
0204 with
Well, it was gradual. You had things going on at the same time. It's really remarkable to me that, I mean, you had the party switching phenomenon, which really hit the legislature slowly but surely. But in 1995, North Georgia Congressman Nathan Deal flipped after the House was conquered by Republicans.
April 95.
He had been a good old Georgia Democrat. He didn't much like life in the minority, so he changed parties without missing a beat, didn't have to change a single position on a single issue. There he was. Then in 1998, a fellow named Sonny Perdue, who was part of the Democratic leadership.
Yes, Senate Majority Leader.
Right, who got into a feud with some of his friends. He flipped. And then it's amazing when you realize that those two men became Republican governors of Georgia for 16 years. Mm-hmm. So really the dominant Republican Party that we know of in that crucial period, the late 90s, early aughts, was very much a product of former Democrats.
Right. Well, and how much...
including, if you continue on to 2004,
right,
Zell Miller.
well, a very quick aside, my first introduction to Zell Miller, and I've said this before in other interviews, I was a freshman at Westminster College up in Fulton, Missouri, watching the Republican National Convention coverage on TV like all the cool kids, and I saw this white-haired senator from Georgia threaten to shoot Chris Matthews in a duel, and I thought, man, this guy is so far out. Well, who is this guy?
Well, I once wrote a review of Zell's book, A National Party No More, which was sort of the signal that he was leaving the Democratic Party for the Democratic Leadership Council's magazine. The headline was Zell Bent. And I talked a little about his personal psychology, the fact that he had had a near-death experience in 1994 in seeking re-election because he was perceived as too close to Bill Clinton.
Oh, very
after
close
another
to Bill
famous
Clinton.
speech in 1992 at the Democratic Convention.
Which you had a hand in?
Slight. That was mostly Paul Begala. I'll take credit for having a lot to do with his flag speech, Confederate flag speech, but not the convention speech.
Well, let's talk about that a bit. It is, a couple of your former bosses, Bob Hurt in particular, said you were the only mortal human being who could, on the first draft, write something that Sam Nunn actually liked. So you had a very skillful pen in taking on the voice of the member, either Sam Nunn, Zell Miller. What was the process there? And using that flag speech as the example.
Well, that was a little different. I would say, as much as I love Sam Nunn and George Busby, they were not known as orators. Either of them, really, they were. Sam Nunn is one of the smartest people who's ever lived in politics. Well, Joe Frank, yeah, that's right. Oh Lord, I hope this doesn't get back to him. But I wrote a few speeches for him, and he could change the grammar to make it wrong in a printed speech that he was reading. So anyway, good guy though. Anyway, what was I? Oh, the flag speech was interesting because he wrote a draft himself. Then I came back with another draft, and we sort of merged the two things. But the basic idea was still pretty much his.
Well, what did you bring in? What elements of yours was merged?
I brought in the sort of casting the Confederacy as a limited, tragic moment in Southern and Georgia history that should not represent our symbol, not the best of who we were. That was my central idea that I brought in. I also strongly suggested that he, in the end of this, I don't know if you read the speech, but when he uses the To Kill a Mockingbird analogy of sort of naming the people that are afraid to change the flag. He named names in the first draft. And I strongly encouraged him not to do that, instead do types, Republicans, Democratic veterans, that sort of thing. But he was a skillful writer in his own right. And I was a thematic writer. Paul Begala was just a brilliant speechwriter, so I was certainly happy to defer to Paul. I mostly helped Zell with his national stuff before that, but he relied on Begala for the stuff that mattered.
Obviously, 1998.
Yeah.
Or excuse me, 2002. Roy Barnes.
Yeah.
The flag is such a overwhelming issue in that race. Of course, you can add to that the teachers, Georgia teachers, the exurban voters with the outer loop. But how much of that flag issue do you think hurt Zell in '94?
It didn't help. It was there was a realignment going on.
Sure, right.
The thing that fascinated me is if you look at his two gubernatorial elections. In 1990, he won comfortably over Johnny Isakson, who was sort of a moderate Republican by today's standards.
Certainly then. He was pro-choice at the time.
If you look at the counties, Zell won a credible vote in North Georgia, his native region in the mountains. 70 and 80% in some counties. In 1994, his opponent, Republican opponent, Guy Milner, classic. Right off a Monopoly set, kind of insensitive, not very charismatic millionaire, Daddy Warbucks type, swept North Georgia against Zell Miller, against native son Zell Miller. And Zell won because he improved his performance dramatically in suburban Atlanta, mostly because of the Hope Scholarship.
Right.
So this was part of the realignment. Zell managed to win with two very different coalitions in '94 and in '98, but he could see how the state was changing.
Right.
By 2002, the same trends that nearly took out Zell Miller in 1994, finally took out Roy Barnes, who had an enormous financial advantage over Purdue, and of course that was also the same year the legislature flipped, or quasi-flipped. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
The
realignment was complete by then. If you ask me what the big factor was, it wasn't any issue. It was demographics. The thing you mentioned.
Yeah.
Finally, the massive population growth in the outer suburbs or exurban Atlanta, which was monolithically Republican, caught up, and in Georgia's case, that was also a very religious vote, which intensified the effect. And all those cultural issues that had gone away finally started to come back.
Yeah, and I think that is something that gets lost in that period between really '88 to when Ralph Reed becomes the party chair, is how influential the Christian right as sort of a separate entity within the Republican Party
and people forget, not only was Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign, by all accounts, the beginning of the Christian right, the mobilization of conservative evangelicals. But when you look at a guy like Joe Frank Harris was, I describe him as the last of the Christian right Democrats, much like Fob James over in Alabama, who was governor a little bit earlier. His signature issue when he was elected in 1982 in a very crowded Democratic primary field was no tax increase. He was the only one in what was then looked like a recession that was going to go on forever, that would promise not to raise taxes. But his base issue was, I'm not going to serve liquor in the governor's mansion, which was a very big deal at the time. He had every evangelical preacher in the state, pretty much, in his camp. And
Which
that was an interesting coalition of business types, and he did some, he did some progressive things as governor. The Quality Basic Education Act, which was Georgia's educational finance pivot towards equalization of dollars for poor and rich and black and white school districts, was an enormous accomplishment that had to be done through the courts in a lot of other states, and I think Joe Frank deserves a lot of credit for that.
Well, I mean, we talked, I think, before we hit play, the two Georgias with Charles Floyd and how you had metropolitan Atlanta and everybody else. And QBE, the governor's road improvement program, where every Georgia governor loves a good road program.
Absolutely.
Developmental highways. This comes out.
God, you're really bringing back
Joe Frank.
Corridor Z.
The Corridor Z. The fall line freeway and.
But the Georgia's regions don't look like they used to. I mean, just one final thought about what I was saying about Zell in 90 and 94. Isn't it kind of interesting that Zell Miller's home base of North Georgia mountains isn't just Republican now, isn't just hyper-Republican now, it is crazy MAGA Republican now. You have Andrew Clyde and Marjorie Taylor Greene representing those same areas that were going 70% Democratic in 1990.
Well, every time I think that the Republican candidate has maxed out the percentage or raw vote, it just gets higher and higher. And obviously there's got to be a stopping point somewhere. But I don't know that we're there quite yet. But I will say that Northwest Georgia has Larry McDonald got reelected for 5 terms.
He's another example of what we were talking about earlier. Here's a guy who is the national chairman of the John Birch Society, who's in Congress as a Democrat.
The
That's
Tale
pretty
of the
remarkable.
Right-Wing Urologist was an article that the great Chuck Bullock wrote.
Oh yeah, but it again, the realignment was a little slow to Georgia, and there were outliers that continued for quite some time. There were even little echoes of the old white Southern Democratic attachment in '92 with Bill Clinton. Who carried Georgia that year by an eyelash.
Well, the bus tour through South Georgia, through Columbus and Albany and Hawkinsville and across that swath of the
I don't
state.
get the sense that any of that had really endured into the latest Democratic win in 2020. It's a different state now, but Democrats have managed to avoid the fate of South Carolina or Mississippi or Alabama, which simply became one-party Republican states.
And do you chalk that up to demographics, or is it something more complex?
Well,
we don't want to argue demographics or destiny because that's simple and very straightforward.
But demographics have a lot to do with it. And also the nature of Atlanta as a cosmopolitan media center. It's just different from Birmingham, as they will tell you in Birmingham, much less Jackson. And then again, you've got the demographics do have a lot to do with it. Look at Tennessee, which just doesn't have a large enough black vote to sustain a competitive Democratic Party.
And that's been a relatively recent phenomenon. Phil Bredesen was governor. Harold Ford Jr. Almost. If it weren't for the Call Me Harold ad in 2006.
Don't get me started about Harold. I once had to be his wingman. He was chairman of the Democratic Leadership Council for a while when I worked there.
Okay.
So yeah, I know Harold.
Well, we'll turn the camera.
Yeah.
Well, tell me about your perch in the Democratic Leadership Council, now defunct organization, but held incredible sway, especially in the early mid-90s when Bill Clinton was in office, became something of a golem for the progressive left, in the same way that progressive Democrats target the DNC now, in the same way that the DLC was this some all-powerful entity that pulled the strings. Were you the puppet master, or was that something else?
No. I was never a puppet master. I wrote a lot. To make a very complicated story simple, the DLC was always sort of an amalgam of two different impulses.
Okay.
One was what I call John Bro centrism.
Okay. Yeah.
Sort of
Louisiana senator.
The deal cutting, middle of the road.
Backslapping, hail fellow
but it was sort of a way station between the two parties.
Okay.
It really was conservadems as the even John Bro had his progressive impulses, but there were quite a few early DLCers who eventually became Republicans.
So
Mike Foster, who was the governor of Louisiana, Nathan Deal was involved in the DLC. I could go on and on. But then you also had people who thought of themselves as sort of innovators, policy innovators.
Okay.
Who, they were the ones that were really tight with Clinton.
So it's sort of the technocratic.
Yeah. Well, the
Atari Democrats were the.
Well, that was a little different.
That would have been. That was
a little earlier, but they were
first.
They were first cousins. What was then called neoliberals, and now later on got to work for Washington Monthly, which was the home base of that whole thing. But people that were program innovators who really thought that you needed to modernize the progressive tradition came up with things like community policing and the national commitment to the national service movement. Reinventing government initiative was very much part of that whole
that would have been
policy thrust.
Bruce Reed would have been.
Bruce was off and on. He was
Clinton's domestic.
And then their think tank, the Progressive Policy Institute, still exists and is still churning out ideas. So it's not totally dead, but the organization's initial goal when it was founded in 1985 was to make it possible for a Democrat to be president.
To push back against the whole November doesn't matter.
There was a term called electoral college lock that people applied to Republicans after the Reagan re-election landslide of 1984, which carried 49 states. So the goal was to make it possible for a Democrat to get back into the White House. That had succeeded in 1992 with a person who was very close to the DLC, Bill Clinton. So then you got to, what's next? Do you all just go into the administration? And a lot of people, including Bruce Reed, did.
Sure.
But the DLC then became sort of a state-focused organization aimed at sort of developing new leaders. And a lot of the people that served in both the Clinton and Obama administrations came out of that background.
Well, Bruce Reed is deputy chief of staff to President Biden.
But cabinet people, Janet Napolitano, Tom Vilsack. There were quite a few governors who, in particular, who became active in national politics through the DLC. So anyway, it served its purpose. We were guilty of what I'd call irrational exuberance over the new economy, probably a little too indifferent to the costs of financial deregulation. So, but a lot of the spirit of that movement lived on in the Obama administration.
Very much.
One thing, since my old boss Sam Nunn had been mentioned in a while, he never left the Democratic Party, even though he was always described himself as a conservative Democrat. And he was an early endorser of Barack Obama
in
2007.
Very seriously considered for vice president.
Yes, and he
had
also
it not been for
quietly advised Obama in the White House on nuclear proliferation issues, which is what he was focused on by then.
How seriously did you take the conversation about him being the vice presidential nominee?
Seriously enough. I mean, he I don't know. Nobody really wants to be vice president. He actually, my first real personal connection with him was was in 1984 when I had done some work with his office as being a federal state relations guy in the governor's office, for Joe Frank and for Busby. He assigned me a research project of figuring out whether he could, maybe it was through Gordon Gifford, who I think you've also interviewed,
that sounds
to
like
figure out whether he could run for president and run for Senate re-election and vice president simultaneously. And I quickly figured out.
That sounds like a Gordon
quickly figured out it was yes, he could. So he was thinking about it just enough then.
Right.
The other weird thing that I don't think people know about, I don't guess he would care if in 1996, Ross Perot approached him. And I've never quite understood what the offer was. It was either for Nunn to run with him or Nunn to replace him as the Reform Party candidate. You remember Perot ran the second time that.
Oh yeah.
So Nunn didn't pursue it, but it was on the table there for a minute, and that could have been just a bizarre sort of development. But he, then there's the whole question of whether, I assume this would be the next question, whether he seriously considered running for president.
88?
Well, and again in going into 92. I know one of my most interesting assignments working for him was clarifying his position on abortion. And this was when he was at least thinking a little bit about running for president in 1992. And his position on abortion had been pretty much pro-life. He opposed Roe v. Wade, and just flatly. And I think he knew you couldn't even consider running for president as a Democrat in 1992 if you were not for Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, not a primary electorate.
So I was assigned to sort of come up with a new formulation of his position when he was about to be interviewed by Bill Shipp.
Oh, a notoriously easy interviewer.
So the reformulation included all kinds of people, including his daughter Michelle, and we kind of tortuously came up with a lawyerly position that was technically pro-choice, and he continued to evolve. But the point is, he always sort of tested the edges.
Right.
Of what it meant to be a Democrat. And I think he got comfortable with it as he got older, because another little story, in 1991, you recall, he led the opposition to the authorization of force for the first Persian Gulf War.
Yeah.
Came under the kind of criticism in Georgia that he had never experienced before from conservatives. And I can remember talking to him during that period right after that vote, and he was in mourning, and we joked in the office that he was mourning the loss of his 80% approval rating. But lo and behold, the first poll that was done after all that, he was right where he always was. He just had a slightly different base of support. Democrats loved him. His percentage of the black vote went up. And of course, he was never in a competitive election anyway, so it was all kind of academic.
Yeah.
But he became more comfortable with being a national Democrat, that's what I'm saying.
Well, you were on his...
Even as Zell Miller was becoming less comfortable.
Right. You were on Senator Nunn's staff during the Clarence Thomas.
Yeah. Yes, I was.
and without naming names, the senator's position and his vote cut against what a lot of his staffers wanted him to do. How did you balance
well,
that as a staffer?
the irony is I had to draft the speech where he introduced Clarence Thomas to the Judiciary Committee for his confirmation hearings. And of course it was all glowing. And much later, when things began to come out, yes, he did have a serious, and I do think that in the end, he felt like he couldn't reverse himself on that, even if he wanted to. and he felt some sense that the guy was from Georgia, and he had some loyalty to him.
Yeah,
But no, you're right. There was this went on for weeks. The discussions within his staff, and there were some very powerful advocates for reconsidering his position. Again, I won't name names either, but
well, the great irony of that is, I think he squeaks by with by 2 or 3 votes.
No, with the I am told, because I was not in. I was working out of Atlanta, by the way.
Okay.
Even though I was his speechwriter, but long story short, I worked out of the district office, and so I was getting reports from the staff in D.C., and there was a discussion going on the floor between him and a couple of staff members before he went up there to cast that vote. So it was a near thing. I think he scraped by a couple of votes. So
Sam Nunn, Wyche Fowler, Democrat.
Oh boy.
And I grew up. This is the first election I remember. As a kid, 1992, the Democratic Senate primary. Alan Dixon, Carol Moseley Braun, and Al Hofeld. It was a 3-way race. Yeah. Carol Moseley Braun beats Alan Dixon, and I can still remember my mom, who had gone back to college at that point, coming back with an Al Hofeld button, and I can remember saying she wasn't. And Alan Dixon was from Belleville, Illinois, a Southern Illinois guy. And
Armed Services member too,
and would not vote for him because of the Clarence Thomas vote.
Yeah. Well, that was a big issue for Carol Moseley Braun. Yeah.
So you get Carol Moseley Braun, who loses to Peter Fitzgerald in '98, and then that opens up the seat for Barack Obama in 2004. So it's a domino effect in politics.
Well, then when you talk about polarization. Again, one of the benefits of working out of the Georgia office as opposed to the D.C. office is I was right there when they were answering the phone from constituents, and we never saw anything remotely like the polarization on that. Clarence Thomas, nothing, not the wars, not anything.
Both sides go to their corners.
Absolutely, no, there was no real discussion. It was pretty much gut.
Which is what we see.
A lot of it was gender based, but not all of it. But anyway. So it was a harbinger of many things.
Think to the Kavanaugh hearings.
Right.
What is that? 2018? I don't know. Time is a fickle thing since COVID. Yeah. Well, as we wrap up, looking at the map in 2024, almost a uniform rightward shift. Now, how deep that is, how lasting that is up for debate. But the one area of the country that actually moved left vis-a-vis 2020 were the Atlanta suburbs. Northern suburbs, south suburbs, Jackson County, Walton County. Is this, from your perch in national politics, looking at this I don't know if we want to call it a realignment yet, a class-based, education-based realignment. Is that what's happening in Metro Atlanta? Is that what's happening in the suburbs with college-educated women? Is that what's happening in inner cities with Black and Hispanic men? What's happening? Explain this all to us in the next 5 minutes, Ed.
Well, I do think that the trends in Georgia are not by any means unique. I do think you're seeing a continuation of the sort of liberalization of not just the inner suburbs, increasingly the outer suburbs, and a lot of that is diversity. Increasingly Asian and Latino, not just Black, continued influx of highly educated folks into the Atlanta metro area, and maybe a little bit of weakening of the Christian right influence, or at least an evolution of it. And so I mean, nothing creates political competition quite like competitive elections. And the other thing you're getting is that people really forget this. And to some extent, it's mitigated by national media, whether we're talking about social media or other types. But Georgia has been the object of saturation, political information and misinformation now for very much for the last 4 years. I mean, and not just in presidential races, the Ossoff Handel race.
Oh my God, the 2017 Georgia 6th.
Yeah. And I mean, since 2016, I should have said. So 8 years of this. And so you can say that means that Georgia voters are better informed or more or less informed, depending on how you look at it, than their peers in other states. But they are very much the object of political mobilization by both parties, 24/7. And again, competitive elections tend to breed more competitive elections. So you have more money going into races in Georgia. The growth of the state's electoral votes have mattered a lot. The decline of some competing states like Florida as objects. So I'm fascinated by the evolution of battleground states. I mean, people have forgotten how recently it was that California was a battleground state. In my adult memory, New York was still competitive.
Illinois,
Illinois, very much so. New Jersey, all these states. So I'm not sure what's going to happen by 2028. I see no particular reason that. I think the reaction in Georgia was part of a national trend. It's mostly attributable to inflation.
I would say
and to a hangover from the pandemic, generally speaking, which got pinned on Democrats.
I would say that's an international trend.
Yeah,
sort of
sure.
You look at Macron in France, the Tories in Britain, the sort of anti-incumbency.
Yeah.
Even though you compare those numbers, those economic numbers, the U.S. economic numbers were far superior to those numbers. But still.
Well, but what I was going to say is that Georgia had a 2-point trend, Republican trend, between 20 and 2024.
1.8. It may be down.
That ain't a lot. And
with higher turnout,
it's less than the national average.
Well,
and with higher turnout, and so will Georgia remain competitive? And this is, I mean, I think the short answer is yes. But there is sort of a thought out there that the South is once again returning to its very recent Republican ancestral roots, but I don't know. The next cycle is going to be very interesting. Let's say you had a Brian Kemp, John Ossoff Senate race. Okay, John Ossoff is a political genius. Best I can tell, if you had to, other than, I mean, there were a lot of people involved. Stacey Abrams, her organizations, a lot of people I don't even know. But Ossoff seemed to be the organizational genius behind the 2020 coordinated campaign in Georgia, as much as anybody was. Brian Kemp, what can you say? He's Ron DeSantis with a little more charisma, not much, but you have to be impressed with the guy. And he has managed to master the art of being a very hardcore Orthodox conservative Republican in many respects. Georgia's abortion law being his big testament, but at the same time, he's popular. Mm-hmm. And he seems to be really good at putting together campaigns. His accomplishment in 2022 has just boggled my mind, personally. So a race like that, is that going to be a national bellwether? Yeah.
Well, and you've got this very interesting, Donald Trump, who defies lots of conventional wisdom, will have been, since the escalator in 2015, somebody who's been on the political scene for, dozens of, a dozen years. I guess he's been on the scene forever. Who knows where
we'll be in 2 years in terms of his substantive agenda. I mean, this very morning I wrote, about his effort to abolish birthright citizenship on his first day in office. That's an astoundingly audacious thing to try to do. There's much more of this to come. There's already been some outrages, policy-wise and personnel-wise. Lord knows what kind of shape the country is going to be in. The only prediction I will make is the Democrats will take back the U.S. House infallibly in 2026.
Well, depending
and
on
they
the
will not take back the Senate.
Depending on the timing of Republican retirements.
Yeah, right. It could happen earlier. But so, for best I can tell, the two-party system is in Georgia to stay, and has reached a level of intensity that I don't live here anymore. I live in California. I miss it. But then I have friends and relatives telling me that they're going to vote early so the campaigns will stop bothering them.
You wouldn't miss the commercials and the text messages. Oh, the text messages. Yeah.
But so that's a bit of, even for somebody with, somebody my age, who's started out with Georgia being part of the solid Democratic South, watched this whole slow transformation into a depressingly Republican state from my point of view, and then now to see it come back, it's been fascinating.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it off. But before we do, how about them dogs?
How about them dogs? As a Democrat, I think I already said this to you off camera, but I figured out that on January the 20th, if Georgia is in the national championship game, we can at least be sure that Donald Trump will be somewhere else other than at that game.
That's right. He did visit. He was at the 2017.
Believe me, I was there. I'm one of the people that stood there in the cold, pouring rain, waiting to get in.
Nasty weather. And that game went to like 1 o'clock in the morning because it went to
Believe
overtime.
Me, I had to walk back to our hotel we were in through that rain after that game. And after spending money we will never see again to get to it. So
I can only imagine what the Westin and the Hyatt Regency were charging for those.
It was bad. But at least we got to stay in the hotel where we got married, the Georgia Terrace.
Oh yeah,
So that was fun, and we do love coming back.
Well, we'll have to get you back on campus, University of Georgia. Ed, I know you've got dinner. Thank you so much. This has been an absolute blast.